All right, today we are diving into a really provocative text called The Original Sin of Nations. It's a piece that asks some fundamental and frankly uncomfortable questions about why the world is the way it is. So let's get right into it. The entire argument really boils down to this one single question. I mean, you look around the world and you see these massive gaps in wealth and stability. So why is it that when some countries try to copy the successful ones, adopting their systems, their politics, it so often ends in failure, or sometimes even bloodshed?
So, right off the bat, the author takes aim at what they see as a huge global misunderstanding, basically a completely flawed answer to that big question we just asked.
You know, for as long as many of us can remember, the standard answer for why the West is prosperous has always been its political systems. The idea is you just install democracy and boom, you get economic success, you get stability. It's an idea you hear everywhere.
Okay, but this is where the author just slams on the brakes. They flat out reject that idea. They say that believing democracy is the cause of wealth is a huge mistake, and they label the worldwide push for it a national-level folly.
And they're not pulling any punches here. They argue this isn't just some academic disagreement. It's a mistake that actively harms the nations that make it. And, in their view, this faulty thinking has gone global.
All right, so if democracy is not the answer, then what is? Well, this is where the text offers its own very different explanation for what it calls the true but totally accidental source of all this prosperity.
This is where we get to the absolute heart of the argument. And it's a pretty abstract idea the author calls the indulgence of the natural person. Now, this isn't a political system or an economic plan you can just copy. It's described as a complete fluke, a chance event way back at a society's founding that just so happened to let a few key people unlock their full potential.
So the way the author sees it, it's like a domino effect. First, this lucky accident, this indulgence, just happens. Nobody planned it. Second, because of that, a tiny, tiny fraction of the population gets to unleash their talents. And finally, that small group becomes the engine that drives everything for the whole society: wealth, science, art, you name it.
And this is the absolute key takeaway here, according to the source. The West didn't invent some secret formula for success. It just got lucky. It stumbled into it. The process was blind and accidental. And that, in the author's view, is precisely why other nations fail when they try to copy it. They're copying the symptoms, like democracy, not the original accidental cause.
Okay, so this is where things take a really dark turn. The author argues that this global misunderstanding isn't just an academic debate. It has severe, real-world consequences, which they describe using some incredibly strong language, like criminal.
This critique then gets extended to how we think about diversity today. The author claims that Western societies are making a fundamental error. They're mistaking what the text calls, without really defining them, immaturity and pathology in human thinking for what it considers genuine diversity.
And from there, the author draws a direct line from this supposed confusion to what they called the most severe fallout of all. They claim that Western immigration policies, built on this flawed thinking, are criminal in two respects. That is a very, very serious charge.
Yeah.
Two specific offenses. The author says these policies add up to national-level repeated offenses, arguing that the West is just stuck in this destructive loop when it comes to immigration.
And here's the cycle they describe, and it's pretty grim. First, Western nations need immigrants to do the tough jobs, but the text claims they have no real assimilation plan for them. Then it alleges that Westerners show contempt for the immigrants' way of thinking, and according to the author, this all builds up until it inevitably leads to harassment, exclusion, and finally expulsion.
And this is where the author uses their absolute strongest language. They don't see expulsion as just a bad policy choice. For them, it is a profound moral failure, a cruel act, a crime, and even a crime against humanity. So, after tearing everything down, you might think that's it, but no. The author actually ends by offering a solution, and let's just say it's just as controversial as the diagnosis.
The whole justification for their plan rests on this one big idea, that the West's prosperity doesn't really belong to the West. The text claims it's the wealth of all mankind, and because of that, there's a global responsibility to manage it correctly for the good of everyone.
So what's the fix? Well, they lay out a three-step plan. First, society has to figure out and master a general standard of humanity so it can tell the difference between that and a pathology. Second, based on that standard, create a real formal assimilation plan for immigrants. And finally, step 3, come up with a plan to treat this so-called thinking function pathology. But, and this is a huge but, the text never actually specifies what this standard or pathology even is.
And that really leaves us with a million-dollar question, doesn't it? The entire solution this text proposes hinges on this idea of a general standard for humanity. But if such a thing exists, who on earth gets to decide what it is? Who would have the authority to define that for every single person on the planet? That's the challenge at the very core of this entire argument.